So we return to Paul's second letter to the Corinthians today, and the lectionary actually has us jumping forward 3 chapters from where we were last week in chapter 8, where Paul was talking about an offering that he wanted to collect for the Jerusalem churches. So let me fill you in on what we've missed. I'll give you the short version. Chapter 9 continues with Paul's theme of generosity. He has some more to say there about the why and the how and the practical considerations for that offering he's taken up. And then in 10 and 11, he turns to maybe the toughest and most personal issue in the letter. There are members of the Corinthian church who've begun to question Paul's leadership and his credentials and his life experience and his jurisdiction, basically. In their eyes, he doesn't measure up to this professional class of preachers who have come into town since he left. And in comparison with them, the Corinthians are saying, boy, this Paul guy, he's not much. And maybe we don't want him as our pastor anymore. These preachers, these super apostles, as he calls them, are really quite impressive from a worldly point of view. They are quite willing to brag about their spiritual experiences and their knowledge and their successes in order to win approval from the Corinthians. And so this all puts Paul in a very awkward position of needing to kind of reiterate the validity of his ministry without wanting to brag like they are, and to boast and to call attention to himself, because he knows that that's not the point. So here we find Paul walking a fine line in chapter 12 and almost sarcastically playing the part of super apostle in order to show what kind of service God really values. Hear now the word of the Lord. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. On behalf of such a one, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except in my weakness. But if I wish to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me, even considering the exceptional character of the revelations. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If you've been to the Roberts house lately, you have probably encountered a certain rose bush at the front door. It is a truly impressive plant because, through no fault of my own, this thing has stayed alive. And not just living, but flourishing, thriving, growing, overgrowing. This is how you know a plant is hardy and self-sufficient. It persists in my yard. Because I'm certainly not doing anything to help it. Now, once upon a time, my mother showed me how to take care of this rose bush. She showed me how to prune it. And I did that maybe once or twice, but beyond that, not much. So, in spite of the fact that I don't take good care of this bush, or maybe because I don't take good care of it, the thing has very nearly become a tree that is reaching over the walkway and over the entryway, and it's terribly inconvenient at this point. Of course, everybody knows roses have thorns, so rose bushes have lots of thorns, and this one will attack you when you try to come into my house. The cat will attack you once you get in, but the rosebush will attack you before you get in. And it's painful if you're not careful. If I had dealt with it sooner, it might not have become such a problem. But recently it got to the point where Papa Norm called me up and said, David, do you want me to come take care of that rosebush for you? And I said yes. Well, what I said really was, no, I don't want to just take it out. It would be a shame to remove it. It's so healthy and vibrant, and I love the roses on it. Could we just try to move it to another location in the backyard? And Papa Norm humored me and said, we'll cut it back for now, and in the fall, when it goes dormant, we will try to move it. I don't know whether we'll succeed or not, but we'll give it a shot. Anyway, all that said, the imagery of thorns in the flesh hits home with me. It's quite relevant to me, and perhaps if you have tried to come into my house lately, you understand as well. As we'll see, Paul has much to say about thorns. He gives us a lot to think about in terms of where they come from and what purpose they serve and how we can or should respond to them in our own lives. But to start, I just want you to think about this. What are the thorns present in your life? What thorns are you dealing with? What is causing you discomfort or pain or difficulty? And what are you trying to do about it? Because with thorns, literal or figurative, I think there are about three basic options. You can either avoid them, like I've been doing. You can try to remove them, like Papa Norm wants to do. Or you can endure them, which most of us find very uncomfortable. Often the first thing that we do with thorns is avoid them, just like I did at home. The thorns could be a responsibility. They could be strife in a relationship. They could be personal sin. They could be something like that. And sometimes because of the pain or discomfort of dealing with them, we've chosen to just sort of turn away from them, look aside, to ignore them. These thorns might seem like they only impact us. And so it's easy enough to do that. I don't want to deal with it, so I don't. Other thorns, though, might have a much clearer impact on other people. There are thorns of addiction. There are thorns of injustice. There are thorns of poverty. There are thorns of tragedy. And it might be even more tempting to ignore those thorns, isn't it? Because they're not hurting me. They don't block my doorway. I'll let you keep your thorns to yourself. Thanks. I don't want to deal with them. Sometimes the very thorns that someone else is dealing with could be the actual excuses that we use to not deal with them, to hold them at bay, to keep them on the sidelines of our lives. I mean, there was this odd assumption among Paul's critics that he can't be God's apostle, or he wouldn't be going through all this junk that he's going through. He wouldn't be facing so much tragedy and personal strife. They looked at everything happening to him, from shipwrecks to beatings to imprisonments to arguments with the authorities, and they concluded that he wasn't really working for God, or else God would be doing a better job of protecting him from all this. I called that odd, but I think that we can relate to that. I think that's something that we've all done, whether we're aware of it or not. I was at a conference a few years ago where I met multiple pastors who had stories to share about the personal tragedies they'd faced and the way that their congregations had kind of left them high and dry when they did. One had a motorcycle accident and a long physical recovery, and that led to depression, which led to his church letting him go. Another had a difficult divorce, a season of personal pain and turmoil, and a church that couldn't figure out the way to support her through it. Another told us about his inability to find work because of a physical disability that most churches said nothing about in their rejections, but obviously they considered to be a deal breaker. We might think Paul's critics were being ridiculous, but we can be just as quick to disqualify someone from God's service because of their suffering. In Corinth, the thorn avoidance was perhaps done a little more openly. Their polished and professional preachers had come along into the community, and they had deliberately turned people away from Paul with all of his weakness and hardship. These self-professed super apostles had shared tales of their personal experiences, their spiritual experiences, and members were lining up for it. You know, believe it or not, the religious world is often about spiritual superiority. If you turn on the TV today, you can find preachers easily who want to share with you their vivid descriptions of personal revelations that demonstrate their spiritual authority and superiority, their privileged relationship with the Almighty. You may have even heard certain televangelists claiming to be able to deliver special messages and revelations received via their own hotline to heaven. I saw things that you haven't seen. I heard things that you haven't heard. I understand things you don't understand. I am closer to God than you are. So pay attention to me. And while you're at it, send money. To all this, Paul responds, yeah, that stuff's happened to me too. I could tell you the same kind of stories those super apostles do. With me, they'd even be true. But look, I know a guy, and this is classic, I have a friend speech. Have you ever done that? When you're telling a story or you're asking a question, you say, I have a friend who, this is Paul talking about himself. But he says, I know a guy who spent a moment in heaven, in paradise with the Lord. I saw things, I heard things, I don't even know how to put into words. And I could run around telling everybody about the incredible divine experience that I had, but I don't. I don't talk about it nonstop like those other kinds of preachers do, because that would take all of your focus off of God and put it onto me. And that's not how it's supposed to work. That's not what my call as apostle is all about. I don't need you to hear these amazing things about me and put me up on a pedestal. All I want is for you to see God at work in my life and be amazed by what God can do. So keep that in mind the next time you hear somebody sharing their incredible account of a spiritual rapture. Is this story more about God, or is it more about the storyteller? Now, Paul never wants it to be the latter. So to keep me honest, he says, God had to balance me out, to keep me from getting too full of myself. After this amazing experience, I received this thorn in the flesh. And Paul isn't very clear about what the thorn is. Many have speculated over the years whether it's a disability or a temptation or it's simply the nonstop dangers and trials that he faces throughout his ministry. But Paul doesn't seem to think we need to know what the thorn is. That's not important. What is important is the reason. He's very clear about the reason. He states it twice in one verse. To keep me from getting prideful and arrogant. To keep me humble. Now there's something to think about. Do your challenges and your sufferings and your thorns keep you humble? Do you take them as reminders of your limitations, your finitude? Reminders that the story doesn't have to be all about you. We'll come back to that in a minute. But for now, just think about it. What is your typical attitude toward your thorns? It can be complicated. While Paul says God has a purpose for this thorn, he also sees that Satan has a purpose for this thorn. Satan is trying to do something here. He even calls the thorn a messenger from Satan. Evil wants to use this suffering to harass and to torment Paul, to push Paul away from God, to convince him to quit. So Paul prays earnestly to God 3 times, get rid of this challenge that I'm facing. I can hear the reflection of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane in this prayer. Father, if there's any way that this cup could pass from me, please take it away. And yet, not my will, but yours be done, God. It's entirely natural for us when we're facing hardship and problems and pain to ask God to remove it. God, take this away. God, please don't leave this thorn in my flesh. I don't want it. I don't know what to do about it. Please take it away from me. We can pray that. Paul prayed that. Christ prayed that. We can pray and we can give that weakness to God, but we also have to be prepared to receive an answer like Paul did and like Jesus did. Paul realized after praying 3 times for this thorn to leave him that it wasn't going away. That God wasn't going to remove it. Indeed, Paul and Paul's ministry were going to be better off for its presence. And so God allowed it to remain. And that's got to be hard to hear. That's got to be hard to hear when we're in pain. That idea that maybe God knows that we're better off with this pain than if God had taken it away. I'm not telling you that as a general principle. I am incredibly wary of anyone saying that whatever you are suffering is given to you by God for a purpose, and so you just need to grin and bear it. That's not always the case. But here with Paul, it is. And he can see it. And he can see that this thorn will not be avoided, and it will not be removed. And so the only thing that he can do with it is endure it. And when he sees that, when he accepts that, something amazing happens. That thorn, that messenger of Satan, actually becomes a blessing instead of a curse. God's final answer to Paul's prayer was, "My grace is sufficient for you. Power is made perfect in weakness." And perhaps what Paul understands in that is what the addict calls reaching rock bottom. You know, he has reached the point where he knows he's not in control, and he has to depend on someone else. He has to depend on God. This is how people work, right? It's only when we're out of strength, it's only when we are beyond ourselves, beyond our own ability, only when we're finally ready to give up and admit we can't make it on our own, that we can really turn to God and depend on God. Look, if I didn't have problems that weren't beyond me to solve, I wouldn't look to God. You never trust in someone when you are able to handle it yourself, do you? I mean, this is why control freaks won't let go until they become unable to hold on, and when they do, they usually find suddenly such a relief that they don't have to. They don't have to be in control. This is why for many a debilitating illness becomes that moment when you can't do everything for yourself anymore. You have to rely on that family member, that friend, that coworker in a way that you didn't want to. And suddenly you find a whole new appreciation for that relationship. Paul has reached that point with God and has found that his weakness is nothing to be afraid of. So he says, I'll be content in my hardships. I'll be content. It's funny, the way that word is translated. It's the same word that the voice from heaven uses at Jesus' baptism. Behold, this is my son, in whom I am content. But there we translate it as well pleased. In whom I am overjoyed. In whom I am impressed. In whom I am thankful for. That's what Paul is saying about his weakness. In my weakness, in my hardship, I find joy. I take delight. I take pleasure. I am gladdened by it because of what I know it means. You know, focusing all of our efforts, as we usually do, on removing or avoiding our difficulties is the wrong goal. Usually all we want is for those hard things to go away. And Paul could have said, look, I prayed 3 times to God to take this thing away, and God didn't do it, so I figured out how to do it for myself. Instead, he said, God answered me differently than I expected, and I accept that. I will boast all the more gladly because this thorn enables the power of Christ to be visible in me. because I know I'm too weak to do this on my own, I can see, you all can see, that God is at work. This hurts. This hurts. And I don't like that. But it reminds me that God is working to get me through it. So I'm changing my perspective. I am choosing to let this painful thing drive me back toward God instead of away from God. Is this thorn, then, God's work or Satan's work? Yes. I think the answer is yes. We can say the same thing about the cross where Jesus died. Is this God's work or Satan's work? Is this a good thing or an evil thing? Yes. Yes, it's both. It depends on your perspective. And whatever challenges you might be facing today, it's probably the same. Our thorns hurt. We don't have to pretend that they don't. We might wish God would remove them. We can even ask for God to do that. And we might not understand why sometimes they remain. But even in the midst of all that, God's grace is sufficient. Do we trust that God has given us enough grace to get through, and not just to get through, but to excel and to flourish like roses amid the thorns? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.